The topic we're going to cover today is going to be the war in Southeast Asia, which we're going to refer to mostly as Vietnam because that's where it's going to be focused on. So we're going to look at what happens in Indochina, which I'll go over where that is, and we're going to talk about how the U.S. actually becomes involved in the Vietnam War. A lot of this is going to be super useful for you next year when you go to U.S. history because there's a lot on Vietnam, as obviously it was a huge part of U.S. history. So some of the vocab you have, you should already know what a guerrilla is. They're a soldier who doesn't fight like in a normal army. They use like hit and run surprise raids, think guerrilla warfare. Ho Chi Minh, he's going to be the leader of the Communist Party in Vietnam, and he's going to start the revolution there. Dien Bien Phu is going to be a large battle. We'll talk about that a little bit. Domino theory, you need to star that one, highlight it, whatever you need to do to remember it. This is the United States idea that just like a line of dominoes, if one country falls to communism, all the others in line will start falling to communism as well. The Viet Cong, they're going to be the rebels in South Vietnam who are communists. So they're South Vietnamese communists. Tet Offensive we'll go over. I'm not going to go over it too much on here. And the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. Pol Pot is the leader of the Khmer Rouge, who are going to be the Cambodian communists who commit a huge genocide in Cambodia against people as they see of enemies against communism. So in Southeast Asia, the area we're talking about is called French Indochina, and the areas that make up French Indochina are going to be Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So after World War II, France wants to reestablish control over this area, so they invade Indochina again, and that fight lasts from right after World War II all the way till 1954 when the French are defeated at the Battle of Bien Bien Phu and are thrown out. The next step is U.S. involvement. Now, this isn't the United States invading Vietnam. This is where North and South Vietnam are split. North Vietnam is communist, controlled by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam is capitalist. The United States is going to assist the South and their capitalist government to try and create a strong anti-communist state and stop their idea of the domino theory. So after 1946, all right, the French reestablished control over Indochina. Just like I said, they want to get the resources out of that area to rebuild France after the destruction of World War II. But the guy over on the right, Ho Chi Minh, he's leading resistance against the French. He is mainly a nationalist. Yes, he's a communist, but he wants to create a Vietnamese nation. And what happens is eventually his group called the Viet Minh defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu, and Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos win their independence as the French exit the region. You can see some of the pictures. The French were like cut off. They dropped paratroopers in. They had to dig trenches, and eventually they were just overwhelmed by the Vietnamese communists who then captured an entire French army. So Vietnam gets divided. If you look at the map on the right, you have North Vietnam, which is communist, and South Vietnam, which is capitalist. It's divided kind of like Korea. Then you have obviously Cambodia and Laos, which become their own nations. So the elections were supposed to occur to reunite the country under a democratic government. But as we know, usually non-communist and communists don't get along, so the election never happens. And that's going to lead to these two kind of in a state of uncertainty of what is going to happen to us, and that's going to cause conflict. So the United States believes in the domino theory. They had lost China to communism. North Korea was now communist, and they were worried about China and the Soviet Union exporting communism to every place they could. And North Vietnam would fall, and then Thailand, and then Cambodia, and then Laos. And before you know it, the Philippines, Japan, and even India are threatened by communism. If you look at that picture down in the bottom right-hand corner, just like a bunch of dominoes, if you line them up in a row, you flip the first domino, all the dominoes fall down and collapse. They think that is essentially what's going to happen, but communists are the ones pushing over the dominoes, and the U.S. is going to try and hold up those non-communist nations. So Ho Chi Minh's goal, he wants to reunite all of Vietnam under a communist nation. And he begins helping the Viet Cong over on the right-hand corner, those guerrillas in South Vietnam, to try and overthrow the government and reunite it. The United States, all the way back in the 50s and 60s, at first only sends aid to South Vietnam. We send our special forces to train the South Vietnamese army. We send supplies, anything they need, aid, money, whatever they need to try and just hold them up. But what's going to happen is eventually the U.S. sees that that is not effective enough to support South Vietnam. What brings the U.S. into the war is in 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin, right off the coast of North Vietnam, the USS Maddox, which is a U.S. naval ship, is reportedly attacked by the North Vietnamese. It'll turn out later that there may or may not have actually been an attack. Nobody's really sure what happened. But this gives President Johnson and Starrett the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And it gives him the ability to prevent aggression from the North. This is not a declaration of war. This is just the U.S. is allowed to protect its interests in South Vietnam. So they basically wrote the president a blank check and told him just protect American interests. That could mean bombing North Vietnam. That could mean sending actual troops to South Vietnam now, blockading North Vietnam. They just tell him to stop the North from being aggressive. So one of the things, kind of a sidetrack, I want to focus on real quick because it's going to help you when we actually talk about the war is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And if you look at the map, you can see the orange line that runs from North Vietnam all the way down through Laos, Cambodia, and into South Vietnam. So most of this area of French Indochina is very, very rural jungle mountains. So it's easy for people to hide. So they literally built like a trail that people walked on at the beginning of the war, and it would bring supplies down from North Vietnam into South Vietnam to support the Viet Cong. And the US is going to do everything they can to cut this trail, because if they do that, the Viet Cong can't attack the South, and the South can get stable and be able to stand on its own. So the first thing the United States does after getting that Gulf of Tonkin resolution is what's called Operation Rolling Thunder, and that's the bombing of North Vietnam. So the idea is to bomb North Vietnam's factories, refineries, ports, so they can't fight anymore. If they can't create weapons, they can't send them to the South. They try and bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but you can probably guess it's really hard to see a one-lane trail in the dark from 40,000 feet. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, they want to cut that supply line, but it doesn't work. They just reroute it. They build new trails. They eventually are even build like roads with trucks on it and keep supplying their armies in the South, and they keep supplying the Viet Cong. The war is mostly a guerrilla war. So the Viet Cong, like I said, they are not like regular soldiers. They are guerrilla fighters. They use ambushes, booby traps, tunnels, mines, all the ways that the U.S. hadn't fought a war. Think of it the exact opposite of World War II. That's how they fight. The Americans then resort to what's called search and destroy tactics. The war doesn't become about taking land or taking territory. It becomes about how many of the enemy did you kill. The count of the dead enemy is the most important thing. So the U.S. would literally send its soldiers out as bait, try and find the Viet Cong, kill as many of them as they can, and then count them. And that was decided if the war was successful or not. The issue is you have trouble telling friend from foe. The Viet Cong build, if you look at the picture on the right, they build tunnels that literally go hundreds of miles, some points, underground. They run under villages. They run between villages. And by day, the farmer who is in the field beside you could just look like a normal farmer. And at night, he's putting mines in the road to kill American troops that walk down it during the day. So it's a very, very frustrating war for the Americans to fight. There are some what we call conventional war, like army versus army, and that's the U.S. military fighting the North Vietnamese army. There's very few battles, and when there's battles between these two, the U.S. almost always wins. The firepower of the United States is overwhelming, the air power, the quality of troops. But one kind of exception to this is in January 1968, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. So Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and that's like a really, really big day in their calendar, so nobody was expecting an offensive from the North Vietnamese. And all at the same time, the North Vietnamese army attacks like 20 American bases. The Viet Cong attack over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. And it kind of shocks the South Vietnamese and the Americans. And even though the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong lose and they take huge losses, thousands killed, lots of their supplies are torn up, the American public now thinks the war is unwinnable. The government had been telling the American public for so long that they were winning, that the war was almost over, and suddenly the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched this giant attack, and it shows that the war is far from over. The American public now says, that's it. We won out of the war. It's over. And this is going to cause a lot of issues in the United States itself. So the anti-war feelings grow. This is kind of the hippie era. If you think about it, it's all the rock and roll music, flowers, the weird fashion, that kind of stuff. Okay. And Americans don't want to be in the Vietnam War. This is a key part of it. So there's a lot of casualties growing. People don't like seeing soldiers coming home wounded or dead. There's the bombing of North Vietnam. There's pictures of towns and villages blown to pieces. Americans are being captured. And a lot of people just start to think it's not America's war. They don't like the draft. They say, why are we in Vietnam? Vietnam's not threatening us at all. So the war eventually does come to an end. So the guy in the top left is President Johnson. He's the guy who really expanded the war. The guy on the right is President Nixon. He's going to be the one that kind of ends it. So Johnson, because people hate the war so much, decides not to run for president again. Richard Nixon is elected. This is going to be a big switch because Johnson was a Democrat and Nixon is a Republican. So in 1973, there's a ceasefire arranged. The United States agrees to withdraw its troops from South Vietnam, and North Vietnam agrees to not invade the South. And considering that there is just one Vietnam, you're going to know that one of the other took each other over within 10 years. So Vietnam is eventually reunited. After the Americans leave the South, 2 years later, North Vietnam invades South Vietnam. They break their promise on the treaty. This is going to be very common among a lot of socialist and communist nations. They'll say they do something in a treaty, and then they'll immediately break it when the Allied forces leave. So 1976, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falls. It's renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam is reunited into one communist nation, which is still technically communist today. Vietnam, obviously, because it's communist, is boycotted by the United States. Relations were very poor. They're just now starting to thaw. And slowly, which we'll go over when we get to the end of the Cold War, Vietnam begins to become more of a normal nation. It has some reforms. Its U.S. relations cool, and it's pretty normalized between the U.S. and Vietnam now. So on a side note is Cambodia, which borders Vietnam. They share a long border right on the south. So the Khmer Rouge are supported by the North Vietnamese communists because they are the Cambodian communists, but they're kind of a different style of communism. They're led by that guy in the top right, Pol Pot, and when he takes over, he unleashes the understatement of the century, a reign of terror on the Cambodian people. He wanted to purge Cambodia of anything that wasn't Cambodian, all the way down to eyeglasses. He ends up killing 21% of Cambodia's population. He would empty whole cities and send them out into the fields to work, and these people had no clue how to grow food, so they would all starve to death. It eventually got so bad that communist Vietnam invades in 1979 and overthrows communist Cambodia. So that's kind of everything we have on Southeast Asia and its conflicts relating to communism and the United States and the Soviet Union's Cold War against each other. If you have any questions, just let me know.